Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Irish Illustrated ISO. I'm Tim Priester from Irish Illustrated, and as promised, about a week to 14 days ago, when we finished the second part of our first-rate series, breaking down Notre Dame versus their 12 opponents and where everybody ranks 1 through 13 at each position, quarterback, running back. We finished offense. Notre Dame was at the top there. And no surprise, Notre Dame is at the top of the defensive rankings. Also, no surprise, Miami and Texas A&M are just there, and Pittsburgh, which is where they make their money on the defensive side of the ball, is up there as well. So we start with the defensive line, and for subscribers to Irish Illustrated, you may have seen a recent story, most underrated Notre Dame players preseason. We did offense. I just did defense the other day, and most of those guys on the defensive side of the ball for Notre Dame are on the defensive line. Josh Burnham, Junior Tui Alamaka, and Donovan Heinisch are all underrated as far as I think most Notre Dame fans are concerned. And they're part of a defensive line that we rated number 2 behind Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh, under Pat Narduzzi, they every year are at the top of the heap defensively. They were pretty porous last year when they lost their last 6 games, but their defensive line is still really good. By the way, the best defensive player on Notre Dame's schedule, or that was in their program last year, Donovan Ezeruku, 16 and a half sacks last year, high draft pick. He's gone, so that's good. Notre Dame, not that Boston College is going to be a real threat to Notre Dame per se, but it is on the road. It is a rivalry, but he's gone. But back to Pittsburgh, Jimmy Scott, Nick James, Blaine Spires, transfer from Utah State a couple years ago. It's a really good defensive front, and I think Notre Dame. We have Notre Dame number 2 along the defensive line, followed by Miami, Texas A&M 4, Boise State 5, and USC 6 along the defensive line. But Pittsburgh is good every year, and their sack totals, their linebackers, we'll talk about them in a second, but are really good as well. But we have them number 1, Notre Dame's number 2, largely because of depth and because of the defensive players that are returning from injury, specifically Boubacar Traore. Jordan Botelho was going to be one of those until a summer injury. And so he'll be back this year, but it'll be a while before they see him, just like it'll be a while before Charles Jagus, Notre Dame's top-notch interior offensive lineman, will be out for a while as well. But Notre Dame, number 2. Number 3 is Miami. And the concern here with Miami, I think, is Corey Heatherman, the new defensive coordinator who was at Minnesota, top 5 defense at Minnesota. There were only 3 teams in the country that had +5 in terms of interceptions versus touchdowns allowed through the air. And Minnesota was one of those. Texas was another, and Notre Dame was +5 in that category. So Corey Heatherman goes from Minnesota to Miami, generally speaking, and we saw this with USC and Danton Lynn last year, who went from UCLA to USC. Great coordinator, but a lot of times it takes a year before they fully kick in and maximize their abilities as a coordinator. And we saw that with Al Golden at Notre Dame when they really struggled in the red zone during Golden's first year at Notre Dame in 2022. But Corey Heatherman's a good coordinator. They have Ruben Bain, Akeem Messidor, and David Blay, a transfer from Louisiana Tech, who is very good at Louisiana Tech. That'll be the bulk of their defensive front. Justin Scott, Notre Dame fans will remember that name from recruiting. He is on that defensive line as well. Texas A&M lost a ton, but they're still good, and that's the nature of Texas A&M and Miami these days. Notre Dame, of course, as well, that they can lose people, but they supplement in the portal. I think Notre Dame benefits from the chemistry that they have, and they spot check with the portal. But a lot of these teams, Texas A&M, they lost Nick Scorton, they lost Shamar Stewart. I know he's having some contract issues in the NFL after being drafted high, and there's talk about him coming back to A&M, but I don't think that that's possible. And then Shamar Turner is also gone as well. A first rounder, 2 second rounders, Texas A&M lost up front, but they still got some good players. Boise State is a strange team because when you look at, they made the playoffs last year and their quarterback's back, so they're still good there. They're awful in some places and they're good in others. Their special teams, you'll find out, really poor. I think the back end of their defense really, really poor, but their defensive line's pretty good. Jaden Virgin Morgan had 10 sacks, 15 and a half tackles for loss last year. He's an all Mountain West Conference selection. Also, an all Mountain West Conference selection was defensive tackle Braxton Feely. He had 5 sacks, 9.5 tackles for loss. So they have two returning all conference players on the defensive line, and they're still really good. USC is number 6, and it's not because of returning players or what they did last year, because they were number 123 in the country in tackles for loss, number 100 in sacks, and 86 in yards per carry against. They have transfer. They have Anthony Lucas coming back, also a former Notre Dame recruit. They have transfers from Georgia and Kentucky, so they will be able to supplement. But again, I really think that chemistry is very important. It's particularly important on the offensive line. Not as much so much defensively, but still, it's transfers and getting accustomed to the new setting, the new coaches, everything that goes with it. And I think Notre Dame has an advantage. Notre Dame has 2 transfers on the defensive line, but that's just 2 parts of about an 8 or 9 part front line for Notre Dame. So, I think chemistry matters there. Moving on to the linebacker position, there are some really good linebacker cores here, particularly starting linebackers. I love Pitt's starting linebackers, Texas A&M starting linebackers. Those two in particular, Miami supplemented with a quality transfer from Rutgers and then one from Auburn as well. But I think what sets Notre Dame apart is just the depth. Now, keep in mind, traditionally we used to talk about 3 linebackers, but pretty much everybody is going with a nickel-based defense, and Notre Dame will essentially do the same thing with Devontae Smith, the transfer from Alabama, playing that position. So essentially, what we're talking about are 2 linebacker positions, and we know, Notre Dame is set there. They're too deep there. They're even if Notre Dame had to go to a 5th inside linebacker, after Bowen and KVA and Osbury and Sneed, Preston Zinter, I think, can play football for Notre Dame and can play football for a lot of teams. But right now, he's not part of that rotation. But I like that group for Notre Dame. Pittsburgh has Kyle Lewis and Rasheem Biles, who are very, very good, a great 1-2 punch. And then their third linebacker is Braylon Lovelace. Among those 3, 263 tackles, 40 and a half tackles for loss. A really, really great starting group there, but depth-wise, I don't know. You just don't know how deep they go. Texas A&M has Torian York. We loved him last year. Texas A&M fans loved him last year as well until Jadarian Price ran around him in the Notre Dame game and scored a touchdown. But he's a good linebacker. Scooby Williams, the former Florida player. And then because nickel has basically become a base defense in football, we included the nickels with the linebackers. Now, in some instances, a nickel is a guy that can be an enforcer at the line of scrimmage. That's Devontae Smith. And then in other instances, it's more of a matchup deal like Jordan Clark, although Jordan Clark, although small, was pretty spunky and pretty physical. Bring up Nickelback's Tyreek Chappell from Texas A&M's a good one as well. We have Miami number 4, Wesley Besaint is excellent. I mentioned the transfers they got from there. They did lose Francisco Mauigo, their leading tackler last year, and an excellent linebacker from Miami. NC State, I don't get where they get all these linebackers from. They must keep them all. I know what they had injuries, and then the backups perform well, but they've got a very deep group. I have them number 5. They might be a little bit underrated because of the depth. When I put Notre Dame number 1, I say it's because of the depth, and I didn't rate NC State higher than 5th. But they had some issues last year, just in their base defense, and so I have them 5th. I have Arkansas 6th, and I have USC 7th. Really, their only returning frontline player is Eric Gentry, the 6'6". I don't know how big, 2', 220, 225 outside linebacker. He's back, and when he's healthy, he's really, really good. But their losses at linebacker were catastrophic. Easton Mascarenas Arnold who was a transfer from Oregon State. He sat out the Sun Bowl when Notre Dame played and transferred to USC. And then Mason Cobb, who originally came from Oklahoma State. Those two were outstanding. They were high volume tacklers. And then I mentioned, Nichols being included with the linebackers. Jalen Smith from USC was a third round draft pick, and they also had Greedy Vance as a linebacker. They lost all of that, so they're no higher than seventh. And then getting onto the defensive backs, I use five categories as a significant measurement, and that was completion percentage, yards per attempt. Notre Dame's always, at least under Al Golden, were very good yards per attempt, and defensive passer rating, and then a touchdown to interception ratio. And again, Notre Dame came way, way out on top of everybody here. A&M is good on the back end, but not like Notre Dame. I mean, I think Notre Dame's a sizable leader over A&M as the number two team at defensive back. Of course, led by Leonard Moore and Christian Gray and Don Schuler at the safety position. It looks like Luke Telich is going to round into shape for Notre Dame, and then Jalen Stroman's a bit of a wild card, of course, because we didn't see him in the spring. He had a second surgery to repair his broken clavicle, but he's a big time hitter. I'm not sure how much he can play on the ball, but as a guy moving up and making stops and being physical, that's what Jalen Stroman absolutely is. Um, I've got I've got Boston College number three, and their safeties are excellent. KP Price and Omar Thornton and Carter Davis. I was very impressed watching film of them. BC is a surprise number three, I think, probably for most listeners. Miami has OJ Frederic and six transfers coming back. They had key losses in Porter, Powell, and Yanni, but they're number four. There are a lot of bad secondaries on Notre Dame's schedule, and so when you talk about starting a first time starter quarterback, whether it's CJ Carr and Kenny Minchie, and as we said many times, expect it to be CJ Carr. There's some as we look at it right now, and of course they'll gain experience as the season goes along, but so will CJ Carr and or Kenny Minchie. So there's some ideal teams to go against. One of them actually is not Stanford. Stanford actually made a top 10 on our list for the first time. They do have a secondary that's notable. USC took a DB from NC State, Bishop Fitzgerald. He'll move into the starting lineup. They do have a transfer from UCLA who was brought over by Danton Lynn, who was at UCLA before he was at USC. But they lost five DBs when you include the nickel Jalen Smith with them. So they have issues back there in number six. So that ends the true talent part of our first rate series. Now this is talent too, but it's a separate entity in special teams that'll be coming up. And then we judge coaching, and I've always included schedules. I know that's not part of the talent part of this, but schedules impact the outcome of games. And when we get to schedules, you'll see that 10-win Syracuse is going to be very, very hard pressed to get 10 wins this year because their schedule is just difficult. We'll get to that at a later time. But as we've gotten through all the positions, Notre Dame is number one, and ultimately I moved Notre Dame from number one on offensive line to number two and moved Texas A&M up because I think Texas A&M's offensive line is excellent. Notre Dame's defense did a good job against them last year, but Texas A&M's offensive line led the way for the number two rushing offense in the SEC last year. So I really have so the 13 teams, Notre Dame and their 12 opponents, I have it broken down into five categories as far as the scoring system up to this point. And I think it's a very accurate reflection of the talent that each of these teams have or have not. And the bottom three are clearly Navy, Purdue, and Stanford. When Navy has a veteran offensive line, they're really, really dangerous. And Blake Horvath is back at quarterback, and I'm sure they'll get it together, but they are really trying to patch it together going into the season. So, and just Navy talent in general doesn't match up with the Power Four conferences. And so they're in the bottom three with Purdue and Stanford. Purdue is in a world of hurt, and Stanford's in a world of hurt too, except for their secondary, as I previously mentioned. The next group, I have Syracuse and BC. Part of it, Syracuse lost a bunch of players. Their firepower on offense, their quarterback who threw for a ton of yards, led the nation in passing yards, and then Boston College, it's just difficult. There are teams now like Purdue and Stanford. I mean, in this NIL era, and then teams raid your best players. Purdue lost Dylan Thieneman to Oregon, the great safety, and so it's just really difficult for some of these teams. And Syracuse and Boston College fall into that category as well. They're the run ahead of, for me, Navy, Purdue, and Stanford. And then the third group, the middle group, Arkansas, NC State, and Boise State. There are a bunch of good football players on those three teams, but depth and then consistency, position by position, it's a little bit difficult to come by. NC State lost Casey Concepcion to Texas A&M. And so those middle rung teams in the Power Four conferences get rated as well by the upper echelon teams in the Power Four. So I have Arkansas, NC State, and Boise State at 6, 7, and 8. The group right before the top of the pack, Pittsburgh, essentially because of their defense and Eli Holstein at quarterback and Desmond Reed at running back. Pittsburgh has talent. That's late in the season. It's at Pittsburgh. It could be a trap game for Notre Dame, but if Notre Dame's in a playoff hunt, Marcus Freeman has proven that he's pretty darn good at getting his team ready for difficult games. But Pitt has talent, and they have defensive acumen, and they're going to be a challenge if you're not at your highest. USC, I have number 5 when you add up all the talent on offense and defense. They've had to replace a lot. It's Lincoln Riley needs to produce. But just when you look at their roster, it is not part of the upper echelon group that we have. And the top 3 are Notre Dame, Texas A&M, and Miami. Tons of talent, as I mentioned before, successful in the transfer portal and able to not just patch holes, but to get wholesale contributions and arrivals from the transfer portal. So we have wrapped up that part of the first-rate series on Irish Illustrated. We'll move on to the final 3 categories: special teams and coaching and schedule. So that's it today for Irish Illustrated ISO. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tim Priester from Irish Illustrated.